Well, hi everybody. Hard to know who's there and where you are and all the rest of it in this situation, but it is wonderful to be with you, and I do thank you for joining along this afternoon. And I just thought I'd start this afternoon with this beautiful artwork. It's from a parish priest, Father Ron Raab in the States, and he's an artist. And he painted this to reflect part of the mystery of Christianity is that God enters into the life of human beings, and that Jesus is present in the midst of the suffering. And of course, Jesus as the model of healing, which is so important for Christianity, and certainly an important message for our study as well. So it's a beautiful artwork. And just to start today, I thought a very short reflection from Pope Francis that he gave last year as the world was starting to learn about this thing we call COVID. And Pope Francis said that we've realised we're in the same boat. All of us are fragile and disoriented, but we're all important and needed. We're called to row together, each of us in need of comforting the other. We've also realised we can't go on thinking of ourselves, but only together can we do this. And I think in terms of how teachers and schools and parents and carers and students have come together to try and make the most of these times, it's a great reminder that together we are doing wondrous things. And I think this initiative of Sydney Catholic Schools to provide these webinars is a great example of that, being together. So I'm really hopeful that this is helpful in some way. And of course, if you would like to put a question in the chat that we can look at the end, please feel free to do so. So I just thought I'd start with something just as a little reminder, and students don't always realise this. What does Nessa say about these HSC exams that we will be doing a little later than expected? Well, most importantly, that when you're answering questions, you've got the questions themselves and then your answers have to provide clear links to syllabus outcomes. Certainly not going to read all of these, but I just want to highlight something that's very, very important. If you look at the outcomes for studies of religion, they're all about higher order thinking. They're about analysis, about really thinking across, as we know, breadth of traditions and so forth, but to analyse what's the real impact. And the real impact is never one-dimensional of these teachings that come from sacred texts and so forth. And of course, the other thing that's so important is how we communicate what is at times quite complex, not always, but sometimes very complex information. And of course, the other thing is that we bring together in a pretty short space of time and writing and thinking a lot of information that we've gathered, and really that comes down to our research, how well we research our topics, etc. So writing well for the HSC really starts long before we get to the HSC, of course. And we do have a little bit more time for preparation this year, so hopefully that's going to get a little bit better. A little reminder that for an extended response in studies of religion, Nessa sets about 800 words, about 6 pages, but of course writing can differ so much. It could be 3 pages of small writing and so forth. I mean, some students can stretch it and do more, but if you can write 800 words or thereabouts of really well explained, specifically supported with evidence responses, then you're definitely on the right track. But please remember, you're writing to the outcomes. That's very important. So the question becomes, how do you provide clear links to syllabus outcomes? Well, that's really simple. First of all, when we're looking at religious traditions, and obviously we're focusing on those and religion and peace today, you've got a significant person or a school of thought. Why are they significant? Do you know why they're significant? Most significant people in schools of thought get the title because they have taken the teachings of their tradition that are drawn from sacred texts and thought about them in respect to their cultural context and so forth, and they have done something unique with them. So why is the person significant? But there's a but. Does the whole tradition draw the same message from that significant person? Does the whole tradition even know about that significant person? And that's where the analysis comes in, particularly with your school of thought or person, that no one person can have a universal impact on a religious tradition to the same extent. And there will be often challenges to that person. Like many of you perhaps might write, if you do Islam, about Al-Ghazali, and he's always written about as if every Muslim knows about him, and he is the numero uno. Now, he's really, really important in Islam. He absolutely is. But even just in his own era, he was challenged by other philosophers such as Ibn Rushd. And in the contemporary context, there are some scholars that would say that perhaps Ibn Rushd presented another pathway. So please think analytically with your person. Same goes with ethics. There's not too much in the syllabus about what you have to do with ethics, but it's the same as every other area, texts and teachings, and what does it look like on the ground. And I'm going to say a little bit more about ethics when we get to the end, but again, it's your breadth of research that's really important, and it can become very one-dimensional. So in the time you've got between now and November to maybe stretch it so that you're bringing in some newer material that shows some contrasting interpretations of beliefs, because not all Christians understand ethics, be that bioethics, environmental ethics, or sexual ethics in the same way. And of course, the practices that we study. And it's really easy to describe what happens in a practice. But the really big thing, and it goes back to the outcomes, outcome H2, what's the impact of religion on individuals and society, it says in the outcome. You've got to analyze what is the real impact on individuals and communities. So you've got to nail those things. But at the end of the day, they're also the only things you can be expected to write about in the depth study and extended response. And of course, in peace, well, then you're going to do the same sort of thing for your two studies, two traditions. There's one other thing that's going to help you provide clear links, and that's writing. And I'll just make this a little bit bigger for a second. And I've been doing a lot of pilot marking since last week when we did the trial, the abridged trial. And this is a snippet from one little piece. And the person that I was marking with, we went over it and over it and over it for ages. And ultimately, it was quite a good piece of writing, okay? And it was in the A range, the A mark range. Now at HSC marking, markers are not going to necessarily have the amount of time two of us spent poring over that to get to that mark. So please, my encouragement to all of you from this point forward is to write, if you're not already doing so, to write your practice responses, etc. And to write often. So write and write often. It's the best thing from this point forward. So I thought we'd take a really quick look at last year's HSC, which you probably already have done, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things that were in the paper last year that were interesting. Christianity itself was interesting because of the question. It was sort of pointing towards ethics, but it really didn't clearly define that. So didn't matter how students answered it, as long as it was answered well, they obviously achieved the marks. But you'll notice in the question, so it gives you a text reference there from St. Paul to the Romans, and it says, how does this teaching, and the teachers out there listening will be sick of me saying it's always about sacred texts and the teachings they inform and what's it look like on the ground in the lived expression. So here you've got an HSC question specifically saying to you, what does that text teach? And then how does that guide ethical behaviour? I'm going to talk about more about that in a second. Within Islam, it picked up on this concept of knowledge that is meaningful. Now, when we have a quick look at all the past paper, just snippets of it, next slide, there's often these concepts that you have to grapple with. So you need to be thinking so much broader than the dot points. Again, it's about the outcomes and the big outcomes of studies religion. So how does, in this extent, this reference actually, again, it was a shame that it wasn't fully referenced in the exam, because it was actually, the stimulus is drawn from, it's according to my friends at Israel, or our friends at Israel, it's the hadith drawn from Quran chapter 20 verse 114. So it's a hadith drawn from that Quran passage. So thinking about concepts like what is meaningful, and lo and behold, in Judaism last year, how does this affirmation, which is an interesting word to put into the question, because that's not one we normally use, but something that affirms, something that affirms that it's a sign or a statement that something is true and correct, right? And again, in Judaism last year, there was this concept of a meaningful life. Now, will they repeat that phrase this year? Possibly not, but it does remind you big concepts, okay? So here it is, the famous, what we do. Everything hinges on sacred texts and using them well. Every single text reference, as the Christianity question in the section 3 last year pointed to, has a teaching, at least one, maybe more. But then what does that look like on the ground in the way any people of any religious tradition live? And that's your pathway you've got to follow. So when we look back at the last 4 years before 2020, you've got there, holistic just means that the exam committee hasn't told you what you've got to write about. So they can set the papers where they don't just tell you what to write about. They can tell you to write about ethics, a person, a practice, or they can actually tell you which combination you have to write about. And we might look at, I think, a practice one of those as we go through. But again, a good life, wisdom, truth, righteousness, nobility, etc. Authentic life. Can you please be thinking from this point forward about those big concepts all the time? And I guess remember, when you see the questions, your first task is to really work out, there will always be a stimulus. It might not be from sacred texts, but your first task is to work out what the essence of the stimulus is talking about. Sometimes the question helps you to do that itself. And then you've got to show the marker that you understand something about that stimulus. You've drawn a concept, an idea from it, and that's going to be holding your response together. Just, I like to go back to this one because it was an interesting year when we did this, and last year's trial asked students to draw 2 areas together. And in 2013, when this was the question, one of the things that students thought they had to do was, when it said discuss the relationship between two, was to actually try and force the person to maybe fit the ethics, or the person to fit the practice. And that wasn't always as easy as you might think, because it just did not work well for some of them. But the best students knew that the glue was something else. It was the big idea that holds a religious tradition together. What is the central concept of this religious tradition, or a central concept? There's always more than one. And to keep it simple, and I'm only focusing on the Abrahamic faiths today because they're the ones that most people do. So in Judaism, this obvious focus on maintaining covenantal responsibility, that gift to Abraham and to Moses and so on, how, and particularly for Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews, how do you shape every aspect of life to maintain authentic covenantal responsibility? Thus, marriage within the Jewish community, for example, is so important. Obviously, in Islam, the concept of submission, and it's a word that can be taken out of context when you're not of the faith, I think, and it doesn't mean to be put down, but it means to be open to God's word, to live a full and rich life in the way that God designed it for you. So, and it says there, for those who submit good tidings to the humble. And just when you see references from the Quran or any aspect of Islam, the little bits in brackets, you probably know that's there to make it have greater meaning in the English translation for you. When we come to Christianity, of course, Christianity is a little different among the Abrahamic faiths. And I love this image from Eichenberg. He's a German artist. And this is called Christ of the Breadlines. And the differentiator for Christianity is that in the person of Jesus, the divine became human. And obviously with a message that was not fully accepted by all in his own time, and thus his death and ultimately the hope of his resurrection. Matthew 25, and this is I think about 4 verses of Matthew 25 condensed into a few words to give the message. One of the things at HSC that has always concerned me, that so many students can't go beyond saying, oh, Jesus' commandment to love, or just saying, oh, the Beatitudes, or maybe blessed are the peacemakers. And yet by year 12, we would hope you would have a much richer understanding of the teachings of all the traditions you study, but if you're in a Christian school, obviously of the Christian scriptures. So this is a really, from my perspective anyway, a non-negotiable text for any aspect of the Christianity depth study, and also obviously for religion and peace, because they're metaphorical. There are so many hungers in the world. People are lonely at the moment because of COVID. People are in isolation and so on and so forth. Lots of sorts of prisons, not just jails. So you can think a bit more about that later. So this is a question that you might not have seen before. And it's actually, it is a religion and peace one. I think it's the only one I've got, but I wanted to just do a couple of little things on sacred texts. And I'm just using a couple of samples from students, right? So this isn't an introduction or anything. It's a snippet of a couple of kids' responses. So you've got this stimulus here from the Archbishop of Canterbury, hurting and fractured world, how, to restore relations. And 2 religious traditions draw on sacred texts and the teachings they inform, etc. So this is one student's introduction to a section of a very good response. And I'm not going to read it, obviously, and we're not going to have time to do all of that. But I've just shown you there in the blue how the stimulus and the question, this particular student adapted it. So the first bit, introducing the teachings by linking them to Jesus and saying what 2 of those teachings may be or are. And the hurt and fracture, it's just changed a little to fit the grammar of the sentence, because you couldn't put hurting and fractured there, but it's quite good. And just there, you look in the parable of the Good Samaritan. And for all of you, really, I mean, you can apply it to just about everything in Christianity, but particularly religion and peace. If you haven't studied it, I really challenge you to have a read of it. You don't need to make too many notes, but just the essence of it is it's the defining explanation from Jesus of who is neighbour. And it's everyone, really. And it's especially those who are different, the outsider and possibly the enemy. And then this student then linked it to Matthew 25, which is, I guess, why I liked it so much and why I've used it. And you can see there, you don't always need all the numbers. So you've mentioned the Good Samaritan, not having to remember chapter numbers and things. And in Matthew 25, and you've just got there 4 words. I think it was, when I saw this, it was a really, I thought, beautiful integration of text. And it's there that Jesus is found. And this glue in Christianity is Christians are meant to be building the kingdom of God in the here and now. It's not just the eternal, it's here and now. And so Jesus is the way to establishing those values of justice and mercy and compassion and or so on. And then this student went on to use a really strong example from taken from Common Grace, which is a great online Christian community, of a particular person from there, Louisa Hope, who was a survivor of the Lint Cafe massacre and is still doing amazing work to create harmonious Australian society because of her Christian faith. So she used that example then to flesh that out. Okay, so that's the scripture there. This one is one from a student from somewhere else, and it's on, this is a different question again. Karen Armstrong's quite a well-known author, and she's a religious historian. She's very talented, very gifted, and very well known. So this one, now this could happen at the HSC, all right? They could tell you one area of ethics and one practice. Be prepared for that. Don't think you're always going to get to choose, because the exam committee can structure the questions any way they like, as long as they just relate to the areas of study that you've done. So in this one, the student was obviously talking about Friday prayer and has linked to the question there. A little bit in brackets, doctrines to their lives, because again, it just needed to nuance the grammar a little, so that's good. Beautiful reference to the Quran to show that, and linking to the beliefs that by completing Friday prayer, not family prayer, they are aided in gaining access, right? So I think, again, it shows you how you can succinctly link teachings, because that the Quran there is teaching, you know, that when you come, hasten, drop everything. It does go on to say, leave your businesses and so forth, but you need to keep them shorter for the HSC. And then this student had email evidence. Now, the best sort of research is to actually sometimes talk to people. And we've got, you know, so many places that we can email and get in touch with. And by and large, people are very generous in responding to questions. So this was in response to a question asking about what is the impact of Friday prayer on their particular mosque community and on the person individually, if they would talk about that. They also asked, how has not being able to go to Friday prayer impacted the community? What does it mean for Muslims when they can't gather, etc.? So that's something to keep in mind. So that's just a little tiny taste of how you can do something with texts to bring alive. So there's your glue in Islam, faithful submission. That's your glue that would hold anything together. So I'm going to move on. I'm actually going to go back to the start of an essay. Now, you can see that, and I'm not very mathematical, and I'd probably give the wrong answer if I was asked. But it's probably not the kind of answer that would get you the job in the long run. I cannot stress to you, as I'm sure all teachers have been stressing to students since day dot, how critical introductions are. Because by the end of an introduction, you've kind of got an idea. You feel like you've got a sense of where this response is going to sit. So we're going to have a look at 3 different introductions to the same question. So this was, again, this is a question where students were told that they had to talk about a practice in this one and an ethics to start off with. And there's this text reference from St. Paul to the Ephesians. And this is an example of how the question gives you a hint of what your focus might be. But again, what does it mean to be good, right, and true? That's another concept for you to consider. So this one practice and one area of ethics. Now, in the trial last year, from memory, I could be wrong, in the Catholic trial anyway, they didn't list the 3 syllabus areas: bioethics, environmental ethics, sexual ethics. I could be wrong, but maybe it was the practice, but anyway, there was something not there. Any time a question at HSC says ethics, it's really directing you to whatever area of ethics you've studied for the tradition. Too many kids last year, I know, I think it was the trial, wrote generally about Christianity and went back to prelim stuff. So remember, at HSC, markers expect to see what you've done in your trial, your HSC year, not in your prelim. So be careful of that. Okay. Okay. Now, so this, I'll just explain these 3 introductions that I'm going to share. They were done working with a group of kids that needed some additional support right at the end of last year, like literally almost on the eve of the exam. So they're quite simple, quite straightforward, and you're going to see quite repetitious, but it was to develop skills in seeing how you can adapt the same set of information to the stimulus, right? So just adapting your information, and it's something I would really challenge you. You don't always have to write full extended responses when you're practicing, but if you get your introduction nailed, and if you've practiced introductions enough, you should be ready for whatever they throw at you in the HSC. And then you've got your foundation. And with a good foundation, you can just then build your story, your cohesive response. So in this one, you've got obviously the stimulus is broken up and highlighted in the blue there from the question. And please, I've just read a few papers recently where kids have written out the whole stimulus. I'm sure everyone's been told never to do that. But to the best of your abilities, please try and do something with the stimulus and all of the stimulus, not just the bit that the question might highlight. Try and do something with it. And you know what? This is like maths. The more you practice doing this with past papers or questions you make up yourself or your teachers send out or whatever, the easier it gets. I don't expect, if you haven't practiced doing this stuff, to just nail a question in the HSC. And you've got C right down the bottom, it goes to truth and then back to right and true. So just highlighting that. In Christianity, in an essay, when you see anything about the light, well, for Christians, Jesus is the light of the world. So you've got that there. Just highlight that. Okay. The kingdom of God. There's your glue for Christianity. Okay. Highlighting that. Now, what you need to come up with for all your religious traditions is some phrases that you can use. And I do not ever believe that you should write, 3 prepared essays, person practice ethics, and just be prepared to regurgitate that, okay? Please don't do that. But do have some phrases in your toolkit that you will always remember to put in, because you've got to show the marker that Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, etc., Hinduism is not one-dimensional. Like I'm wearing black and white today. That's pretty one-dimensional. I've got a touch of red. So you've got to be shades of grey, all right? And they aspire to. It doesn't mean that all Christians get there or all Christians get as engaged. So you're starting to introduce a sense of analysis that you are going to show that balance, that nuance, those shades of grey in your response. It implies Paul's message, the kingdom as members of the body of Christ. That's a beautiful 3-word text that you can use in just about anything for Christianity. So Paul's teaching, about Christians going to all be members of the body of Christ implies that it's all going to be the same in Christianity. But there are so many differing understandings of Paul's writings and of the Gospels, of course. So there's very diverse interpretations of what is right and true. So in your essay then, and the marker might think, oh, this is going to be interesting. They're going to show me differing opinions, perhaps. So you're going to show the marker that you understand there are different ways of being Christian. Okay, I just highlighted this. It doesn't matter whether you're studying baptism or not for Christianity, that baptism is a responsibility. It's a commitment. It has a reciprocal responsibility. And so it's a good way of adding some terminology and showing an added level of depth for your markers. So the next one, I'm not going to do in depth with all of these because you can read them yourself if you want to later. So we changed the question around. So this one was Paul and environmental ethics, and it's the same sort of thing, right? These students were studying environmental ethics, but to see, so for example, down the bottom, differing understandings of Paul's text and varied responses to issues, for example, climate change, right? Now, so if you're doing environmental ethics, I can assure you to present it as one-dimensional, as if all Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus are great environmentalists, is not in actual fact the reality. And in Christianity, certainly there are quite a range of environmental skeptics who are Christian, and they use the Bible to justify their reasons for being environmental skeptics. Now, you wouldn't focus on them because they're the minority. But if you're writing about environmental ethics, as these kids are going to be, you would need to bring in that little. However, not all Christians, etc. So don't forget to do that. And then this one was ethics and baptism. So it's pretty much the same. It's obviously all pretty much the same, but with just those little tweaks. So it just gives you some insight into how, if you just get good at practicing, and so that these particular students had to practice using some other stimulus and whatnot just to get the hang of how they can answer their questions. And this one just looks at the end, says diverse interpretations, what it can look like. Remember, you're always looking at even the little words can look like, because it's not going to look the same for everybody. Okay. So going back to our little diagram and research and lived expressions. Okay. So when you boil down your religious tradition depth studies, it comes down to this: 6 little dot points that you have to do. Okay. You shrink it down, you think that's manageable, I can do that, right? So, however, when we, and I'm not going to put all the necessary words and that and whatnot, and they don't always use the verbs. You know that by now, you've done enough practice. But I do like the demonstrate one, show by example. The lived expression, the how, is the part where it really sorts the sheep and the goats. If you really want to get up in that A range, this is where you absolutely need to have those examples of to illustrate what these sacred text references and their teachings absolutely look like in practice. Okay, so I just thought I'd use as a bit of an example to illustrate what I mean by this. Bioethics. All right. Now, one of the things that was the great hope of this syllabus is that it would engage with the world as things moved on in the world. And certainly, and again, in the last week, I've read a lot about euthanasia, and you still read about this passive euthanasia and active euthanasia and whatnot. But when you look at the map of Australia that's on screen, a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of people in our country aren't aware of just how quickly voluntary assisted dying, which is what the technical term is we're using, has become legal in Australia. And it's currently in the Queensland Parliament, and it is going to be passed up there. And it's about to be introduced into our Parliament. And then you can see there, March this year, it became legal in Tasmania, and in June it became legal in South Australia. Now, this didn't happen without an enormous amount of input from all the religious traditions, okay? And if you haven't done this, if you are doing bioethics, I'd really encourage you to explore this further to show the HSC marker that you are relating, as H2 says, religion, not just to individuals in their religious traditions, but to society. So, for example, this was in the Herald on the 7th of July, and this particular politician here in New South Wales, he was hoping to introduce the bill into the last sitting in August. And now I did have a look today, and as far as I know, I couldn't see that he did, because I think with everything COVID, but it is coming to New South Wales. Now, the interesting thing is he's tried to soften it. If you read this little snippet here from the Herald, that it's a little bit different to the other states, where there is a real fear among it's not just about Catholics, you know, it's about any religious organisation that runs any sort of healthcare facility, a hospital, and particularly aged care. They're all worried about this. Do we have to provide assisted dying in our aged care facility, for example? So it's interesting that he says they've softened the stance so that, for example, St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney or something might not have to be prepared to allow it in their facilities. Okay. Of course, Archbishop Fisher, his area of absolute expertise is law and ethics, and he, of course, has spoken out very strongly against the bill being introduced in New South Wales and the potentiality for that to pass. And there's a little link there, and you could read about that. But of course, you can't just write from a Catholic perspective. And this is a more evangelical or conservative Christian movement, and it is across Australia, but this is the New South Wales branch. So you do need to have shades in this. If you are doing bioethics, you do choose to do this, but the same goes for any area of ethics. As I've said, in environmental ethics, you've got to look at the climate deniers and how they use religion and the texts of the traditions to deny that human beings have any impact on climate. If you're doing sexual ethics, it's done in a very narrow way from my 20 odd years of marking. And of course, there is so much discussion today about the whole complexities around gender diversity. And there are different opinions in different areas of traditions, and that's across the board. So if you're doing sexual ethics, to do some investigation into how different branches of religious traditions are responding. For example, in Islam, it's definitely a minority. It's definitely in the West, and it's certainly not approved by mainstream Islam, but the inclusive mosque movement, where people of all sexualities, genders come together, etc. And it's a way of exploring and having a conversation about remaining faithful to the teachings of the tradition in a very different way to what's been accepted as the norm. With the voluntary assisted dying, you had in in Tasmania and Victoria, their overarching council voted that they would allow, not that they would necessarily administer, but that they would allow voluntary assisted dying to take place in their healthcare facilities. So it would probably be an outside doctor who would provide the medications that bring about the death through VAD. But that was quite different to say what any of the Catholic healthcare organisations would allow. So that they're things to be really conscious of. So this is a little example from Islam about how you might write about something like voluntary assisted dying. And again, you'll notice that it goes straight to the text. So this wouldn't be, and obviously it's not an introduction, this is a body part of the response. And you'll notice it's broken up. It's not written as one big slab of text, okay? It breaks it up into different ideas. So the first part is always introducing, well, what's the teaching, where it's coming from, and what's it saying in this instance about illness. So you've got to show the marker some understanding of the foundational principles that are coming out of this. And so the two texts there that obviously God determines, al-Qadar, it is God's determination when anything happens. And of course in Islam, there is a requirement to seek treatment. But one of the things that's really important in Islam is this concept that necessity can override prohibition. We'll get back down to that in a minute. So, and again, it says such teachings can assist Muslims. All right. You know, maybe it's not always perfect, but they can assist adherents to be faithful in their submission, even in suffering, in the hope of gaining paradise in the afterlife. So then you actually specifically are talking about your example. So the Australian National Imams Council, as with so many others, came out against the Victorian legislation when it was going through the Parliament, and they did so by quoting the Quran, which says, of course, you can't kill yourself. And then they talked about this concept of passionate, compassionate, palliative care. Every single religious tradition is pushing for better palliative care. That's holistic care of the person who is really seriously unwell and often moving towards the end of their life. It's spiritual, it's physical, it's for the family, etc. Now, this is the bit I think where people doing this sort of ethics get mixed up, and they start talking about passive and active euthanasia. And the Imam said that even if medications that are usually forbidden, narcotics, are necessary, that's okay. This is where this concept of necessity can overcome prohibition, right? Even if the person loses consciousness and so forth. So that's a really important point in terms of Islam and bioethics. And I've read a lot of bioethics responses through Marking Islam for a lot of years, and you don't always get that level, okay? So if you could put that in. And then this concept of the burden of patience. So a few little hints there, not just for writing about bioethics, but for writing about, like right intention is imperative. So many of you who do Islam will study Hajj and so forth, okay? So I just want to get on to, some of you have seen this, and how do you get good at this stuff? Well, I think you all know the answers, and I keep coming back to Abdul Rahman, who he obviously topped the state in 2019, and he did it not by having copious amounts of notes and so forth, but by writing every single past paper, a response to every single question, so that he was so ready for whatever the markers gave to him. And I was trying to get hold of some of his notes, because he went into the HSC with only 15 pages of notes. And just as I was about to start the webinar, I got the message from his teacher with his notes attached. So what I'm going to do is I will put some of his notes into this PowerPoint before I share it with you. But what I've done is just a little mock-up of the sort of thing that should be enough information, this sort of thing, for you to write a response on an area of study. Now, when I looked at his notes very quickly, they're all handwritten and they're all tiny, so I will give you those. But say you were doing baptism, there's 4 sacred text references there that are important, but you can obviously choose other ones because there's so many. And then there's, well, what are the teachings there? And what are some really non-negotiable words that you're going to use when you're talking about baptism. And then we get to this concept of what might it look like in practice. So I put over here for the first one, so the Trinitarian formula, when you're talking about Christianity, the Trinitarian formula is for Christians the perfect model of right relationship. So if you're talking about any area of ethics, in every ethical decision, Christians are challenged to be making a decision that keeps them in right relationship with themselves, with others, and with God. Right? And obviously incredibly important for religion and peace, and so forth. So this whole idea of, you know, after a Christian gets baptized, what happens? Now, probably and possibly many Christians don't think about their baptism as often as they could, but it does call people to right relationship and living baptismal responsibility. So the example there is actually one from Religion and Peace, and it's about the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And remember, you've got to have examples across the breadth of the tradition, especially for something like baptism. So, and often it's very, it can be written from a very one-dimensional viewpoint, and it talks about candles and oils and all those things that are not necessarily used by everyone in the tradition. So watch that, because you're writing about it across Christianity and it's quite different. But the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America became what you call a sanctuary denomination in 2019. And they specifically linked that to their baptismal responsibility. And that's a little quote there from their website. We are brought into a covenantal relationship with Jesus Christ to strive for justice and peace, etc. A sanctuary denomination goes back like, you know, centuries and centuries, to where if you were in a Christian church, you were safe from any authorities. So that's to have sanctuaries to be safe. And so they took their baptismal responsibility so seriously, and I think they have 9,000 branches in the States, so quite a significant number, to offer sanctuary to migrants or people, sorry, I guess, people seeking refuge from other countries for fear of their own lives. So that's a really good example, and wherever you can, if you can double dip across the parts of your responses, that would be really fantastic as well. Okay, so that's an example there for them. The next one on the list here is about this whole concept of what does it mean to belong to the body of Christ. Okay, and this is where you can also bring in a little description of what happens, right? As well as the water baptism in the Trinitarian formula. And you can show a little bit of differentiation, that obviously the statement of faith is done differently across the denominations of Christianity, etc. So there's a little bit there about what happens. The example here is Layla and Danny Abdallah. Now, remember, the big bit in the syllabus for all of your practice questions is impact on individuals and communities. So, you know, if you're studying marriage in Judaism, what is the impact, not just on the single person, the couple, but what's the impact on the Jewish community? And certainly there, that link back to maintaining sense of community, the broader community, the Jewish community, to maintain the covenant, to continue the lineage, to continue the traditions, because Judaism is such a small religious tradition. There's about 18 million Jews in the world. So that maintaining that link, that lineage, is imperative. So you need ways of finding stories that help you explain that. So Layla and Danny, of course, tragically lost their children, and their three of their children, and their niece in that dreadful drunk driver accident last year. But this year, it needs to go further. They've always said only because of their faith and only because of their faith community could they keep going, right? And so this year, on the first anniversary of their children's death, they launched I Forgive Day. And I'm hoping lots of you have heard about that. And on the 1st of February, maybe they did something with that at school. And based on St. Paul's text there to the Ephesians. And I would really encourage you to watch, there's a YouTube link there to Danny's speech, and to take just a little grab out of that you could use in a response, so that you're showing this is what living out the gift and the responsibility of baptism can look like. Do all Christians do it this way? Possibly not. So, you know, you've got to keep searching. And then down in the final one about the gift of salvation, etc., and the symbolism of going down into the water and dying, etc. I've used Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, and she is a Canadian evangelical Christian environmentalist. She's a scientist, of high caliber scientist, right? And you find that most of the skepticism, most but not all of the skepticism around issues of such as climate change and the ability of humans to impact on climate come from that more evangelical worldview within Christianity. And so she really, really, really is challenging all people, but she's trying to make inroads with those Christians who don't believe that humans can impact God's creation. And she takes her baptismal commitment very seriously, because to work for maintaining God's creation. So there's a few hints there, and I guess, as I said, hopefully in the time between now and November, you're going to have time to develop the examples, and then you're going to have time to practice writing about those examples to a range of questions. And the thing is, if you know your examples are really, each one of them is a story. If you know the story well enough, you don't need loads of notes, because you know the story in your head and you know the story in your heart. So the story will come naturally. And if you've decided upon your set range of sacred texts that are the non-negotiables for each element of your study, you know, maybe 3 for baptism, like maybe 9 all up for Christianity, but don't forget Matthew 25 and the parable of the Good Samaritan, then it's really, really manageable. And when I get to share Abdul Rahman's, you can see how he went about doing it so that he was able to top the state. So I'm just going to finish with this, and then I'm going to go and stop the share and have a look at the questions and see what questions we've got. And I know, thank God for the Olympics and the Paralympics, because it's given us all a little bit of a break and a little bit of wow, I think, in the last whatever weeks it's been. And the other day, this wonderful young woman for Australia, Katja Dedekind, she won a bronze medal. This is the script of the interview that's just got a little slide out of it on there. And the interviewer said to screen, she knows she swam, and that's the time she swam. But because she's visually impaired, she didn't know what had happened. She didn't know the result. And the interviewer told her, and she responded, a PB and a medal. That's awesome. A PB. So I guess the encouragement to everybody, the teachers, the students, the mums, the dads, the carers at home helping keep this thing going, is that we're all trying to chase our PB, and we can only do it together. And we can do this, as all of these wonderful people have shown us over and over again, that overcoming hurdles, it's possible, and we don't do it alone. So I'm just going to stop the screen share, and hopefully it's going to be some questions No, there's no questions, no open questions. So if anybody's got a question, because we ran out of time last time, I've left time this time for any questions, anything that doesn't make sense completely. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll be sharing the PowerPoint, and obviously we'll have access to that as well. And if any questions come to light, if it doesn't make sense when you get it, email Anthony Munro. Oh, there's a question, and he'll email me. Look, is covenant the easiest central concept in Judaism? I have used it, and I've always found that students can grapple with it because it says, well, you know, it's a bit like baptism, really. It's a covenantal relationship as well, that there are commitments that come with being the chosen people of God, the Jewish people. And so, and those commitments are clearly defined in the mitzvah. I suppose one thing I would say, you know, how kids often write at HSC about, you know, Jews keep all 613 mitzvah and whatnot. Well, that's not actually possible to do, because some of them, you know, keeping of slaves and so forth are no longer possible. Some of them only apply if you live in Israel. And of course, you know, quite a large proportion of the Jewish population don't live in Israel. So they can't all keep all of those mitzvah that are mentioned in the Torah. So, and that, again, that's a little thing that you can nuance when you're writing about Judaism. But yeah, I think it's probably the easiest for kids to grapple with, because, you know, the promise to Abraham to be the father of a great nation. And so that great nation can only continue as long as Jewish tradition continues. So again, if you think about marriage in Judaism, so much, or so many of the practices of Judaism take place in the home. You think about Passover and the telling of a story and the children being involved. Yeah, and every Friday, you think about Shabbat, Friday night, Saturday. So many of the rituals are in-home rituals, and that's where the tradition is maintained and carried forward. And so I think that makes covenant a good one to do. And I think that's the only question we got. Okay. All right, my dear friends, thank you so much for being with us. And oh, there's something in the chat. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Lee. Look, just keep doing what you're doing. You're doing an amazing job. So thank you. Take care, and God bless.